The courtroom laughed when a famous lawyer mocked Keanu Reeves, until he stood, quoted a forgotten law, and turned the entire trial upside down. What they didn't know was that he'd been quietly preparing for this moment his whole life. But why was he really being targeted, and who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The courtroom was unusually crowded for a civil hearing. Camera crews had set up outside hours earlier, drawn by the name alone: Keanu Reeves. Inside, whispers buzzed like static. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for the moment that would go viral. At the plaintiff's table stood Vivian Cross, a woman known in legal circles as a closer. Her suits were always sharp, her tone always surgical. This morning she wore charcoal gray with pearl earrings. She didn't need to introduce herself to the press. She already had her own Wikipedia page. On the opposite side of the room sat Keanu Reeves, alone at his table except for his lawyer, Henry Braddock, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who hadn't tried a case in years. Keanu had asked for him specifically, not for his courtroom theatrics, but for his silence. The two had barely exchanged a word all morning. Vivian adjusted her mic and stood. "Your Honor," she said with confident precision, "we are here today because intellectual theft has consequences." She turned and pointed toward Keanu, her voice smooth but sharp. "Mr. Reeves, respected actor, producer, and public figure, stands accused of plagiarizing an original screenplay written by a young man named Daniel Shore. A screenplay that, coincidentally, disappeared from circulation after being submitted to his production company last year." Some in the gallery gasped. A few reporters scribbled faster, others typed directly into tablets. Judge Harlan nodded. "Proceed, Ms. Cross." Vivian took a small remote from her table and pressed a button. A large screen lit up beside the judge's bench. It displayed the title page of a screenplay, Saltwater Rising by Daniel Shore. The date stamp read, October 3, 2022. Vivian continued, "This is the original script, a story about a small coastal town fighting corporate pollution and rising seas, woven with a father-son narrative of loss, redemption, and environmental sacrifice." Then she clicked again. "This," she said, as the screen shifted to a poster mock-up, "is The Rising Blue, a film produced by Mr. Reeves, released just 5 months ago." On the screen was a dramatic silhouette of Keanu standing at the edge of a flooded shoreline, a boy beside him. Tagline, "The tide always remembers." The similarity was immediately obvious. People in the gallery exchanged glances. Vivian stepped forward. "We will show that Mr. Shore submitted his screenplay to Shadow Lantern Productions, Mr. Reeves' company, through a mutual contact. That his script was acknowledged, reviewed, and then never heard from again." Keanu remained motionless, writing something in a narrow notepad with a black pen. "We will also show," Vivian said, "that several of Mr. Shore's unique narrative devices, including the recurring Saltbird motif, the underwater flashbacks, and the lighthouse finale, appear verbatim in The Rising Blue." She glanced sideways. "Coincidence? Not according to our expert witness." Vivian turned slightly, letting the silence hang. "And finally, we will hear from a former intern who worked at Shadow Lantern during the time the script was under review. An intern who claims she witnessed internal discussions about using Saltwater Rising as inspiration without compensation." At this, the room murmured louder. One person let out a short laugh. Vivian looked at the judge. "This is not about celebrity. This is about integrity, and this court deserves the truth." The judge nodded again. "Defense will respond after recess." He looked to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, do you have any immediate comment before we adjourn?" Keanu looked up, calm as still water. "No, Your Honor," he said softly. "Not yet." When the gavel struck for recess, the courtroom erupted into low chatter. Journalists rushed to file instant headlines. On social media, the news was already trending. Keanu Reeves accused of screenplay theft. Some tweets called it shocking. Others called it impossible. Keanu didn't move. He remained seated, flipping to a fresh page in his notepad. His lawyer, Henry, leaned in quietly. "He came in swinging," Henry muttered. "Hard to blame her. The evidence is sharp, at least at first glance." Keanu nodded but didn't look up. "I'm not worried about first glances." Henry tilted his head. "You know what they're calling her in the press, right? The wasp in heels." Keanu finally smiled. Barely. "I'm more interested in the intern." Henry glanced across the aisle, where Vivian was conferring with her client, Daniel Shore. The young man looked overwhelmed, barely older than 30, in a wrinkled shirt and a suit that didn't quite fit. His hands trembled as he drank from a paper cup. "I don't think this is Daniel's idea," Keanu said quietly. Henry frowned. "You think he's being used?" Keanu shrugged. "I think he's scared." The bailiff called time. Everyone returned to their seats. When court resumed, Vivian was already standing, a small stack of documents in hand. "Your Honor, I would like to present our first piece of physical evidence. Time-stamped drafts of saltwater rising from Mr. Shore's writing software, dated well before Mr. Reeves's film entered pre-production. These were verified by an independent forensic analyst." She handed copies to the clerk, who distributed them to the judge and defense. As Keanu received the packet, he flipped through the pages, quickly but methodically. His expression didn't change. Vivian clicked the remote again. This time, the screen showed side-by-side comparisons, script excerpts from both films. The similarities were unsettling. "In Saltwater Rising," she said, "the protagonist's son wears a necklace made of driftwood shaped like a bird. In The Rising Blue, the boy wears a carved salt bird given to him by his father." She flipped again. "In both scripts, the climax takes place in an abandoned lighthouse during a storm. In both, the father sacrifices himself by staying behind while the tide rises. And in both, the final line spoken is nearly identical." She read aloud, slow and deliberate. "The sea never forgets what we leave behind." A pause. She clicked to the final slide. A brief email thread between Daniel Shore and Shadow Lantern's submissions coordinator. The last message was simple. "Thanks for sharing. We'll review and be in touch." They never were. Vivian looked around the courtroom. Theft doesn't always look like someone breaking into a vault. Sometimes it looks like silence, like a young writer submitting his story and watching it come back to him without his name. All eyes turned to Keanu. He still said nothing, but his fingers tapped slowly on the table. 4 beats, then 3, then silence. The judge finally said, "Defense, you'll have your turn. For now, we'll hear from your first witness after lunch." The court recessed for lunch, but Keanu didn't leave. As the benches emptied and the clatter of heels echoed through the hall, he remained seated, flipping back through his notes. Henry returned with a coffee and set it down without a word. He knew Keanu didn't drink much during trials. He thought more clearly on an empty stomach. "She's building a solid narrative," Henry said. "Emotion, underdog angle, the visual parallels. The public's going to eat it up. Especially since you haven't denied anything, not yet." "I will," Keanu said softly, "but not to win a soundbite." Henry sat beside him, reviewing the documents again. "The intern, Clara Maris. She worked for your production company 2 years ago. Moved to LA right after college. Barely stayed 6 months." Keanu didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim, dog-eared folder. Inside were handwritten notes, printouts, even 2 postcards. One was from a climate summit in Iceland. The other was from a retreat on the Oregon coast. This project came from a dream. Keanu murmured. A real dream. I woke up and wrote the first line in the dark, half asleep. I still have that page. Henry looked skeptical. That's not evidence. No, Keanu agreed. But it's the truth. Just then, a low voice interrupted. Mr. Reeves. They looked up. Daniel Shore stood a few feet away, alone, holding a paper napkin with crumbs on it. He looked uncomfortable, like someone sent on an errand they didn't volunteer for. Sorry, Daniel added quickly. I know I'm not supposed to talk to you directly. Miss Cross is in the hallway. Henry stood up, wary. We can't discuss anything related to... But Keanu raised a hand gently. Let him speak. Daniel hesitated, then stepped forward. I just wanted to say, I never wanted this to get this far. I didn't even hire Vivian, my producer did. After he saw the film trailer. Keanu nodded slowly. You wrote something personal, and then watched it come alive with someone else's name on it. That must have hurt. Daniel's eyes dropped. Yeah. Keanu leaned forward. Do you believe I stole your story? Daniel looked up, eyes troubled. I don't know. There's so much overlap, but the way your film ends, it's different. My script ended with the boy leaving the sea behind. In yours, he swims into it. Keanu's expression didn't change, but Henry noticed a flicker of something, a tightening in the jaw. Ask yourself this, Keanu said calmly. What's harder to copy, a plot or a reason? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. I should go. As he turned and walked away, Henry exhaled sharply. That wasn't wise. He could spin that on the stand. Keanu returned to his notes, flipping to a clean page. At the top he wrote, Sometimes the truth waits in silence, just long enough for the world to mistake it for guilt. 2 years earlier, the air in Vancouver still held the softness of early spring, mist on the edges of the streets, new leaves trembling above the sidewalks. Tucked behind a faded mural and 3 crooked bicycles was a low-slung brick building that used to be a mechanic's garage. Now it was a community art space called The Grove, a place for underfunded artists, filmmakers, and musicians to meet, share, and create. Inside, folding chairs circled a battered projector. A dozen people filled the room, each one carrying dog-eared screenplays or storyboards made with colored pencils and hope. At the back sat a man in a dark baseball cap and old flannel shirt, almost invisible. He had signed in as Keanu Reeves. For nearly 6 months, Keanu had been quietly funding workshops like these across North America. He never announced himself. He never pitched anything. He just listened. Sometimes he left envelopes behind, unsigned checks tucked between pages of someone's script. The goal wasn't fame or credit. It was to find truth and help those still brave enough to speak it. That day in Vancouver, one young man caught his attention. He was thin, fidgety, mid-20s, and had a voice that cracked every few sentences from nerves. His name was Daniel Shore. He stood near the old whiteboard, gripping a bundle of handwritten pages clipped with mismatched paper fasteners. I don't have a title yet, Daniel said, laughing nervously. But it's a story about a father and daughter trying to survive in a world that's lost its seasons, where summer stretches too long and the oceans eat the coast. And it's about memory too, what we forget, what we pass down. Some participants looked at their phones, others nodded politely, but Keanu leaned forward. Daniel read for 12 minutes, stumbling once or twice. His dialogue wasn't polished, but his imagery was haunting. A broken-down greenhouse by the sea, a clock with no hands, a girl drawing forests from memory. When Daniel finished, the room was quiet. Someone clapped, slowly. Then others joined in. Keanu stood and walked to the front, keeping his voice low. I just want to say, he said, that was beautiful. Not because it was perfect, but because it came from somewhere honest. Daniel blinked fast. Thanks. I wasn't even sure I should read it. Keanu smiled. You should always read it, even if nobody listens. They shook hands. Daniel's were cold and damp with sweat. Did you write all that by hand? Keanu asked, noticing the lack of formatting. I can't afford final draft, Daniel said. I just use notebooks, one per draft. Keanu nodded, impressed. That takes grit. That was it. Keanu never asked for a copy. Daniel never offered one. They spoke for another minute about silent films and post-apocalyptic metaphors. Then Keanu slipped out before the group dispersed. Daniel tucked his script into his backpack, unaware that this brief meeting would later be twisted into a legal trap neither of them saw coming. 2 months after that Vancouver workshop, Daniel Shore found himself seated in a glass-paneled conference room at a downtown high-rise in Los Angeles. The invitation had come out of nowhere. An email from a junior executive at Silver Light Acquisitions, a subsidiary of TechCore Studios. They said they'd heard about his script through creative channels. He didn't ask how, he was just grateful someone had. The man across the table wore a gold watch and had a smile that looked practiced. We think there's potential here, he said, holding up a printed copy of Daniel's handwritten script. Raw, obviously, but the themes are current. Climate collapse, memory loss, intergenerational hope. Very now. Daniel's heart was pounding. You really read it? Every word, the executive replied, but here's the deal. We'd need to buy it outright, no back end, no royalties, a flat fee. We don't do co-writes with new talent. Our studio will take it from here. Daniel looked down at the contract. $10,000. That was rent for a year. Or, more importantly, time. Time to write again. Will I be credited? Possibly, the man said smoothly. But that'll be up to development. You know how these things go. Daniel hesitated. He didn't know how these things went. But the idea of someone making his story real, even if it wasn't his name on the poster, felt like oxygen after months of holding his breath. He sighed. Over the next year, Daniel heard nothing. Then came rumors of a new indie film, quietly in production, directed by an anonymous team under a shell company. When the trailer dropped, eerie music, washed-out landscapes, a father and daughter bracing against storms, Daniel recognized his own dialogue, his scenes, his characters, even the greenhouse by the sea. But the credits didn't list his name. Instead, they listed the producing entity, Row 29 Films. No writers were credited. Daniel called Silverlight. The number was disconnected. Emails bounced back. His stomach sank. One night, frustrated and scrolling, he discovered something that twisted the knife deeper. The film, his film, had recently been acquired by a festival circuit partner. And the executive producer? Keanu Reeves. That's when the panic set in. Daniel remembered the man at the workshop, the one who called himself K.C. Reeves. It had been him all along. Had Keanu stolen his script after all? He didn't want to believe it, but the timeline seemed to match. In a moment of desperation, Daniel posted on a private screenwriter forum asking if anyone had experience with copyright issues in Hollywood. Someone replied. Then someone else. Within days, a lawyer named Vivian Cross reached out directly. Let me handle this, she said. You're the real writer. And if Keanu Reeves stole your story, we'll make sure the world knows. Daniel hesitated. He didn't want a fight, but he wanted fairness and credit, so he said yes, unaware that he had just stepped into something far bigger than a stolen screenplay, something manipulated behind the scenes by TechCore itself. 3 weeks later, Vivian Cross stood at the window of her downtown Los Angeles office, sipping tea while staring down at the city below. The script pages Daniel had provided lay on her desk, now marked with tabs and notes. She had no doubt he was telling the truth. His original draft bore the raw fingerprints of a young but brilliant writer. But Vivian saw something more. She saw an opportunity. The entertainment law world had grown stale. Her last 3 high-profile cases had ended in quiet settlements, but going after Keanu Reeves, that was different. The optics alone would guarantee attention. An underdog screenwriter pitted against a beloved, stoic Hollywood icon. The press would eat it up, and Vivian had no intention of losing. She called her assistant. "File the civil complaint. Let's set the wheels in motion. I want press releases ready by morning. This isn't just about plagiarism. This is about systemic abuse of creatives." But behind her carefully curated outrage, there was another motive. TechCore Studios had quietly backed her practice for years, and when they found out Keanu's film could threaten their own upcoming climate-themed blockbuster, they'd pushed for a response. A lawsuit wasn't just retaliation, it was strategy. What no one knew, not even Daniel, was that TechCore's executives had already been in possession of the workshop guest list from Vancouver, and buried in that file was a name they had highlighted in red: K.C. Reeves. The man who'd slipped into the back of the room unnoticed. The man whose own film, The Drowning Forest, bore uncanny similarities to their stolen property, because they had stolen it first. Vivian knew this lawsuit wasn't built on solid ground, but that didn't matter if the public believed the story. And that's what she was counting on. Meanwhile, back in Vancouver, Keanu sat in a quiet cafe overlooking the harbor. It was the same place he had met a handful of young filmmakers 2 years ago. The day he heard Daniel's voice for the first time. Not on a stage, not in a polished pitch room, just a room filled with people who cared deeply about telling the truth. He remembered Daniel's eyes, clear, nervous, but burning with urgency as he described a world slowly swallowing itself, and a father who refused to let his daughter forget what the earth used to sound like. Keanu had loved the premise. He had told Daniel as much. But he had never taken a copy of the script, not even a photo. He had never needed to. His own version of the story had lived in him long before that day. Now, accused of theft, he looked out across the water and felt a strange calm settle in. "They don't know the truth yet," he said softly to himself. "But they will." In the background, his phone buzzed with a new email from his legal counsel. A date had been set. The courtroom drama was about to begin, and Keanu wasn't planning to sit quietly for long. The courtroom lights felt harsher now. Vivian Cross had just finished her triumphant round of testimony, her voice dripping with confidence. She sat back in her chair with a faint, practiced smirk, as if the trial had already concluded in her favor. All eyes now shifted to Ava Monroe, Keanu's attorney, known for her unshakable calm and razor intellect. She adjusted her glasses and stood up slowly, walking toward the witness stand where the young intern, Matthew Gray, sat, looking both nervous and eager. "Mr. Gray," Ava began, her voice soft but steady. "You mentioned earlier that you saw Mr. Reeves holding a printed copy of Daniel Shore's script in the production wing at TechCore Studios, correct?" Matthew nodded quickly. "Yes, that's right. And you're certain it was the same script being discussed here today, the one titled Beneath the Ashes?" He hesitated for the first time. "Well, I saw the title on the front page, and the format looked like a screenplay. It matched the font and everything." "Did you read any of the pages?" Ava asked, taking a slow step forward. Matthew blinked. "No, just the cover. But I know what I saw." She nodded, then turned slightly to the judge. "Let the record show the witness did not confirm the contents of the document, only the cover page." Justice Hollings gave a tight nod. Ava turned back to Matthew. "You also stated that Mr. Reeves didn't notice you, and that you only saw him for a moment before he walked into a private editing room?" "Right," Matthew said. "I didn't want to interrupt him." Ava held up a photo. It showed the hallway in TechCore's editing suite. "Can you identify where exactly Mr. Reeves was standing when you saw him?" Matthew leaned forward, squinting. Right here," he said, pointing to a hallway near the fire exit. Interesting, Ava replied, because that's the corridor leading to Studio C, not the editing wing. Matthew's brow furrowed. I guess I might have been mistaken about the exact spot. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Vivian shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Ava didn't press the contradiction further. She didn't have to. Instead, she walked to her table and picked up a slim black folder. Mr. Gray, are you aware that Mr. Reeves was shooting a scene for Monarch Forest that same day, in Studio C, at the exact time you claim to have seen him holding this script? Matthew looked stunned. I didn't know that. No further questions, Ava said calmly, and returned to her seat. Vivian stood. Redirect, Your Honor. Justice Hollings nodded. Briefly, Vivian walked toward the stand with renewed poise. Mr. Gray, is it possible you simply misremembered the location, but still clearly saw Mr. Reeves with the script? Matthew looked unsure now. I think so. I mean, yeah, probably. Vivian smiled tightly. Thank you. That's all. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Ava looked at Keanu. He hadn't flinched. He was still writing. And she knew. He was getting ready. The judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom slowly emptied into the marble corridors. Keanu remained at the defense table, still scribbling in his notebook, his eyes tracing patterns no one else could see. Ava stood beside him, reviewing her notes, but her attention was partially fixed on Daniel Shore, who had stepped out with his legal team and was now pacing quietly near the window. Something about Daniel's posture unsettled her. He looked like a man trapped between obligation and unease. When court resumed, Daniel was back on the witness stand. His shoulders were tight, and his hands clutched the wooden railing like a lifeline. Vivian stood and motioned to proceed. Mr. Shore, she began, you've testified that the film Beneath the Ashes is your original work, correct? Yes, he replied quickly. And that you developed the script on your own over the course of 18 months? That's right. And at no point did you share this script with Mr. Reeves, she asked. Daniel paused. We met at a writing workshop in Vancouver. Vivian nodded. Please answer the question directly. Did you at any point provide Keanu Reeves with a copy of your screenplay? He hesitated again. No, I didn't. The silence that followed was heavier than a gavel strike. Vivian pivoted smoothly. But you believe he saw it through other means, perhaps via shared cloud storage in the studio, correct? Daniel nodded. That's what I was told. And you have reason to believe this because someone from the studio alerted you to unusual file access, correct? Yes. Vivian turned to the judge. We'll present that digital access report in our later segment, Your Honor. Justice Hollings gave a measured nod. Now it was Ava's turn. She rose slowly and approached Daniel, her expression unreadable. Mr. Shore, she said, her voice softer than it had been with the previous witness. Would you describe your meeting with Mr. Reeves during that workshop? Daniel's eyes dropped. It was a group session. He was quiet but generous with feedback. I was surprised he was there at all. He didn't announce himself, just listen. Did you speak one-on-one? A little. I showed him my outline, not a full script. He told me to keep working. He said, "The heart's there." I remember those words. And after that, I never heard from him again, until all this. Ava took a step closer. You're under oath, Mr. Shore. Did you ever send him the full script in person, by email, by messenger, anything? No. The word came out almost as a whisper. And you're aware Mr. Reeves' film was written and produced under a pseudonym, and that the production team was separate from TechCore Studios? Daniel blinked. I learned that later, yes. Ava paused, then leaned in. So if he never saw your full script, never received it directly, and didn't work through the same studio, why are you so sure this is theft? Daniel didn't answer. She let the silence speak louder than anything she could have said. The courtroom sat in silence. Even the distant hum of the overhead vents seemed to pause. Evil. Ava let the silence hang. Then, softly, she continued. Mr. Shore, would you agree that your story and Mr. Reeves' film share thematic elements? Climate collapse, a father-daughter relationship, moral ambiguity? Daniel nodded cautiously. Yes. But themes are not protected by copyright law, are they? No. And scenes like the one in both scripts where a forest fire forces characters to choose between saving wildlife or human lives, would you say that's a unique scene? Daniel looked uncomfortable. It's not common, but I don't know if it's unique. Ava nodded. Let me read you a passage from a 2002 environmental screenplay submitted to an open contest. It describes nearly the same scene. That film was never made, but the script was publicly archived. Daniel's brow furrowed. I don't think I've read that. Your Honor, Ava said, turning to the bench, we will submit this earlier screenplay into evidence, dated nearly 2 decades before Mr. Shore's version. The point being, this idea, powerful as it is, was in public circulation long before either of these men turned it into art. Judge Hollings raised an eyebrow. So noted? Vivian rose abruptly. Irrelevant. The case is about direct theft. Ava didn't flinch. Then let's discuss the studio network, where Ms. Cross claims Mr. Reeves accessed the script. She turned back to Daniel. You said you uploaded your screenplay to the studio's server? Yes. Before or after you signed a contract? Hatter, Daniel admitted. It was part of the submission process. And that server was hosted by TechCore Studios, which has since partnered with numerous projects. Yes. Do you have a list of who had administrative access to that server? No. Did you see Mr. Reeves' name anywhere in the records? No. I was told by a friend that someone accessed it using a guest pass. A friend who works at TechCore? Yes. Have they testified? No. Have they provided a sworn statement? Daniel paused. No. They're afraid to lose their job. Ava turned to the judge. Your Honor, we'd request the court compel TechCore Studios to provide server logs, guest pass issuance records, and metadata on document access. The judge considered. I'll allow it. Subpoena to be issued immediately. The courtroom buzzed. Vivian's jaw visibly tightened. Daniel sat, his gaze drifting down to the table. From the defense table, Keanu Reeves finally looked up from his notes, not to speak, not to argue, but to quietly meet Daniel's eyes. And something shifted in Daniel's expression. Not fear, regret. The desk was silent except for the soft rustling of paper. A single lamp threw a warm circle of light onto the cluttered surface, where thick legal textbooks lay open next to highlighted screenplay guides. In the center, a spiral notebook rested, with pages filled margin to margin, notes, cross-references, questions, and underlined phrases. Keanu Reeves sat still, hunched slightly forward, pen in hand. His eyes weren't just reading, they were scanning, dissecting, absorbing. He hadn't spoken a word in court that day, not one. But that didn't mean he was unprepared. Quiet didn't mean indifferent. It meant listening harder. An old memory flickered. He was 10, curled up on a brown corduroy couch, watching his mother underline a legal document with a yellow marker. She was a paralegal then, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table in Toronto. Her voice was tired but certain as she explained the paperwork aloud to herself. The law doesn't bend to feelings, Keanu, she once told him, but it does protect those who read it carefully. He hadn't forgotten that. Now, more than 4 decades later, those words felt like armor. Keanu flipped back a few pages in his copyright law reference and stared at a clause he had marked earlier but hadn't fully understood until now. It was a narrow provision about derivative works, a section most people skipped unless they were neck-deep in entertainment law. This clause didn't dispute ownership. It questioned intent. It clarified that if a new work was independently created with substantially different themes, tone, and characters, even with superficial similarities, it could not be considered infringement unless there was proof of direct access. Direct access. He turned to his notes on Daniel's testimony. Daniel had admitted, under oath, that he never gave Keanu a copy of the script. The intern, shaky and inconsistent, had claimed Keanu probably saw it through studio servers. But that wasn't proof. Not legally. It was assumption, circumstantial. And in the world of copyright law, circumstantial wasn't enough. Keanu jotted down 2 words beneath the clause. Access gap. He circled them twice. His hand paused over the paper. If he could demonstrate that the similarities were coincidental, built on common genre tropes, and that there was no provable access to Daniel's draft, he might have a defense. No, he would have one, but something else stirred in him. This wasn't just about defense, it was about something personal. He turned to another notebook, smaller, dog-eared. Inside were scribbles of his own film idea, a climate-themed story about a dying forest and a child who learns to speak the language of trees. It was metaphorical, poetic, and completely different in structure from what Daniel had pitched. And yet, now that he thought about it, both had a young protagonist, both involved nature, and both ended in silence. Keanu leaned back in his chair. Not everything that looks alike is theft. Sometimes it's resonance. But could a court see the difference? He turned the page and kept reading. Keanu opened a fresh page in his notebook and drew a line down the center. On one side, he wrote, "Their claims." On the other, "My process." One by one, he listed the key overlaps that Vivian Cross had presented in court. The young protagonist, the forest setting, the symbolic ending. Then, opposite each, he traced back his own notes, sketches, and journal entries. Most of them predated his encounter with Daniel Shore. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone else, yet. He just needed to make sure he wasn't wrong, that he hadn't unintentionally absorbed someone else's idea and passed it off as his own. The thought terrified him, not because of the lawsuit, but because of what it would mean about who he was. His hand slowed as he reached a page dated 6 months before his Vancouver workshop. The entry described a dream he'd had after visiting a burned section of the Amazon with a nonprofit. In it, a little girl tried to plant seeds in ash. No one listened to her, except the trees. It was raw, but it was his. He underlined the words, "She spoke," and the trees replied. That wasn't in Daniel's version. Daniel's script was about government conspiracy and underground climate rebels. It was more political, sharper, necessary in its own right, but different. Keanu scribbled a note. Same genre, different spirit. Across the room, a kettle clicked off. He hadn't even remembered turning it on. He walked over, poured tea into a chipped ceramic mug, and returned to the desk. The night outside the window was quiet, broken only by distant traffic and the occasional echo of laughter from a neighboring apartment. He sat again and reached for a book he hadn't opened yet. Creative Authorship and Legal Boundaries. A dense title, but Ava had suggested it weeks ago. He hadn't gotten past the introduction until now. Flipping through, a single paragraph caught his eye. Derivative work claims often hinge not on direct copying, but on whether a creator had reasonable access to the original. The burden of proof lies in establishing both access and substantial similarity. Without both, infringement cannot be presumed. He read it twice, then 3 times. Access and substantial similarity. He'd been so focused on disproving similarity that he hadn't realized the case's weak point might lie in access. And he had one witness, someone who might prove he never touched Daniel's script. His brow furrowed. If that person still worked at the studio, maybe they had access logs. Maybe something even stronger. He grabbed his phone and typed a name into the Notes app. Harper Chen. She was the studio's junior IT coordinator back then. Smart, precise, quiet. They had spoken briefly during a tech issue with his editor. She'd mentioned how every document access was tracked for security and peace of mind. Security, peace of mind. He highlighted the name, underlined it, then whispered aloud, "That's the key." Keanu set his tea aside and powered up his old laptop, the one he used only for writing. He hadn't opened it in weeks, but it still booted up slowly with a familiar mechanical hum. On the desktop were dozens of folders, project outlines, draft scenes, scanned journal pages, dated backups. He clicked on a folder titled Ashseed Originals. Inside were files with timestamps reaching back nearly 3 years. The earliest document, dated April 9th, was a handwritten scan. It read, in Keanu's clean cursive, "What if the earth could speak? What would it say? And who would it choose to hear it?" He smiled faintly. That line had haunted him for months. It was the seed of the whole story. It wasn't a plot. It wasn't a borrowed narrative arc. It was something deeper. A question only he could have asked, born from something personal and wordless. He uploaded a few of the oldest scans to a cloud folder labeled Court Archive Timeline. Then he opened his email. Harper Chen. He wasn't sure if she still worked at TechCore Studios, but he remembered her kindness and her attention to detail. She had helped fix a corrupted sound file in post. Quietly, without fanfare, he drafted a message. Subject, a personal request. "Hi Harper. I don't know if you remember me. We spoke briefly during post-production on the Ashseed short. You helped fix an audio crash late one night. I've never forgotten that. I'm reaching out now because I'm involved in a legal dispute regarding the origins of this project. There's a claim I accessed someone else's script while it was stored in your studio's system. I know it's an unusual ask, but I was wondering if logs exist showing access permissions, especially to the file titled The Burning Green, during the period between August and October 2 years ago. I'm not asking you to take sides, I just want the truth. And I believe the data will show I never opened that file. Please let me know if you can help. Either way, thank you for your time. Warmly, Keanu." He stared at the email for a long moment before hitting send. Then he sat back and let the silence return, a silence he'd grown used to over the years, the kind that allowed him to listen more than speak. That had always been his strength, even when others mistook it for weakness. In that quiet, he heard his mother's voice again, faint but clear. The law protects those who read it carefully. And beneath that, another voice, his own from years ago, standing on a stage during an open reading in a Vancouver community center. "I'm not here to impress anyone. I just want to say something true." That was still all he wanted, to say something true and protect the truth. He turned off the lamp, leaving the notebook open on the desk. Under the name Harper Chen, he had added one final word, hope. The courtroom was tense as the judge announced a recess, but far back in the gallery, a pair of wide, curious eyes hadn't looked away from Keanu Reeves the entire morning. Maya Clark, 12 years old, sat perched on the edge of her seat, her leather-bound notebook open on her lap. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her dad, Nolan Clark, a journalist for the Tribune, had brought her along for the week because her school was on break and because he couldn't find a sitter. Maya didn't mind, not one bit. She was a film student in the junior academy at Emerson Prep, and she'd written her first script at age 10. She adored independent cinema, knew how to frame a shot, and had memorized Keanu's performance in A Scanner Darkly, down to his eyebrow flicks. But this was more than a celebrity sighting. Something about the trial didn't feel right. Especially the way that lawyer lady, Vivian Cross, kept speaking like the outcome was already decided. Maya flipped through her notes as people filed out of the courtroom. Her heart thumped faster. There, page 7 in her journal, a sketch she'd made during last year's school trip to the West Coast Film Archives. They had visited the Independent Visions exhibition in Vancouver, and in one glass case, protected by UV-filtered glass, was something Maya hadn't forgotten. Hand-drawn storyboards signed by KR. In the corner, dated in thick black marker, March 2021. At the time, she'd been too excited to process it. She remembered thinking, "Whoa, Keanu Reeves makes storyboards like that?" She'd copied one of the sketches in her notebook that day. It was a scene of a flooded coastline where children were planting saplings along the shore. She had loved it instantly. And today, in court, when Daniel Shore's so-called script excerpt was projected on the big screen as Exhibit A, Maya's jaw had dropped. The description of that same scene, word for word, had shown up in his dialogue. She'd turned to her dad and whispered, "That's not his." He had hushed her gently, never taking his eyes off the judge. Now she watched Keanu from afar. He looked calm, tired, focused. He wasn't talking to the press. He wasn't defending himself to the crowd. He was writing. Again. Just like he had during the last session. Maya stared at the thick notebook in his lap, mirroring the one in hers. She felt a twist in her chest. Someone had taken something from him, she was sure of it, and no one in the courtroom seemed to notice but her. She flipped her notebook closed and stood up. No one paid attention to the 12-year-old weaving her way through the crowd. Her dad was already on his phone. She moved quickly, ducking around the side of the courtroom toward the rear exit. If they weren't going to listen, she'd tell Keanu herself. Maya slipped past the security rope near the side hallway, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. She had been to enough movie sets and behind-the-scenes events with her dad to know that if you walked like you belonged, people usually didn't stop you. That rule held true, at least until she reached the corridor marked "Authorized Personnel Only." A large bailiff stood by the door. He looked down at her. "Lost kid?" She took a deep breath and straightened her spine. "I'm here to deliver something important to Mr. Reeves." Evan, his brow rose. "You have a badge?" "No, but I have this." She held up her leather notebook. The bailiff looked unimpressed. "You'll need to go back out front and—" "Please," she said, her voice quieter now. "It's about the storyboards. From the Vancouver exhibit. I think he's being accused of something that isn't true. I saw his work before that other guy even had a script. It was dated. I drew it down." For a moment, the bailiff didn't move. Then his eyes softened. He leaned in slightly. "Wait here." He stepped into the private chamber hallway. Maya stood still, her heart pounding. She could hear the murmur of conversations behind the doors, the scuff of shoes on marble tile. After what felt like forever, the bailiff returned and nodded once. "He'll see you, but just for a minute." Maya followed him down the hallway, past wood-paneled doors and framed black-and-white portraits of judges. Finally, they stopped at a smaller consultation room just behind the courtroom. The bailiff knocked once, then opened the door. Keanu Reeves looked up from a stack of papers, his dark suit jacket folded neatly on the chair beside him. He smiled faintly when he saw her, that signature soft smile she'd only ever seen in movies. "Maya, right?" he asked. Her eyes widened. You know my name? I saw your father's name on the press badge. You've been sitting beside him since opening statement." Maya stepped into the room and pulled out her notebook. Her hands were shaking a little. "I saw your storyboards at the museum in Vancouver over a year ago. And one of the scenes, Daniel showed it in court, but yours were dated before his script. I copied one into my notebook that day. I think it could help." She flipped to the sketch, her pencil drawing of the children planting trees in the flooded bay. Keanu leaned in slowly, studying it. "I remember this," he said softly. Maya looked up, hopeful. "Can this prove anything?" He didn't answer right away, but there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there all day. Something like resolve. Keanu turned the page back and forth, his thumb tracing the curve of Maya's pencil lines. The children in the image wore rain boots. One held a sapling, another pointed to a rising sun beyond the water. In the corner, she had even copied the date from the original display, March 12, 2021. "You saw this at the West Coast Film Archives?" Keanu asked gently. Maya nodded. "Room 4, Independent Visions. It was next to a display about hand-drawn animation cells. My whole class saw it." Keanu looked at her, eyes steady. "And you remember the date that clearly?" "I wrote it in here the same day," she said, tapping the page. "My teacher made us journal about the exhibits. I didn't know it would matter until I saw that lawyer." Vivian, using Daniel's version of the exact same scene. "But yours came first." "I know it." Keanu's lips pressed together in a thin, contemplative line. He stood up slowly, then crouched down to meet her at eye level. "Maya, you may have just given us a turning point," he said quietly. "And that's not a small thing." Her cheeks flushed. "Really? Really?" He nodded. "This isn't just about the sketch, it's about what it proves. Public display, authorship, intent. If that museum cataloged it properly, it might invalidate their entire claim." Maya blinked. "You think so?" He nodded again, more firmly this time. "Sometimes, it only takes one person seeing clearly for the whole picture to change." Just then, Ava Monroe pushed through the door, a stack of notes in hand. She paused when she saw Maya. "Keanu, we need to—" "Oh." She gave Maya a brief glance, then a second one when she noticed the open notebook. "She's with me," Keanu said simply. Maya quickly held out the drawing. "This sketch matches a storyboard that was on display in Vancouver. It's dated before Daniel's draft." Ava scanned the page, then looked at Keanu. "If we can prove the museum had it on public display before the alleged creation date of Daniel's script." "Exactly," Keanu finished. "It could be the key." Maya stood there silently as the two adults exchanged looks. Then Keanu smiled again. "You should be proud of yourself, Maya," he said. "You noticed what no one else did." She grinned, her eyes bright. "My film teacher always says, great stories begin when someone decides to look closer." Ava reached for her phone. "I'll call the museum now." As Maya slipped back toward the hallway, she glanced once over her shoulder. Keanu was already flipping through her notebook again. And for the first time in days, she saw him smile like a man who knew he had something to fight with. The hallway outside courtroom B was mostly quiet, except for the low hum of reporters whispering into their phones and court staff moving through with urgency. Keanu stood by the water fountain, reviewing his notes, as Ava Monroe reviewed a file nearby. His face was calm, but his eyes scanned every word, every comma, as if they might unlock the truth. A small voice cut through the shuffle. "Mr. Reeves?" He turned slowly. A young girl, no older than 12, stood nervously in the hallway, holding a worn, leather-bound journal. Her dark curls bounced slightly as she stepped forward, eyes wide with both fear and admiration. "I'm Maya," she said, offering a small wave. I think I saw something important." Ava took a step forward to intervene, but Keanu gently placed a hand on her arm. "It's okay." Maya opened her journal with slightly trembling fingers. "Last year, my school took a field trip to the Film Heritage Museum downtown. There was an exhibit on independent cinema. Your name wasn't listed on anything, but I saw these hand-drawn storyboards. They were just sitting there in the climate cinema section." Keanu knelt slightly, his expression softening. "Baby had notes on the margins," she continued. "They looked just like the ones you showed in that interview last month. Same tone, same art style. I remembered them because they had these little sun and leaf doodles in the corners." She turned to a page in her journal where she had copied a few of the details. This was the date of the exhibit, March 14th, last year. I even wrote down the name of the curator. She said a photographer from the museum archived all the display materials. Keanu nodded slowly, reading every line of Maya's careful handwriting. "You remembered all this?" he asked, deeply moved. "My dad's a reporter," she said proudly. "He's inside right now, covering your trial. I told him, but he said it probably didn't matter." She looked down for a second, then back up. "But I thought it might, so I came to find you." A moment passed before Keanu spoke. "It matters. It matters more than you know." Ava raised an eyebrow, already sensing the weight of the moment. Keanu turned to her. "We need the exhibit logs from the museum. And if there's photo documentation, that might just give us everything we need." Maya held out her journal. "You can use this if it helps." He took it gently, as if holding something sacred. "Thank you, Maya." She smiled. "I just want the truth to win." And with that, she ran back toward the courtroom doors, disappearing into the crowd. That evening, Keanu sat alone in his apartment, the journal open beside him and a laptop illuminating the room. He navigated to the museum's online archive directory, fingers moving faster now, driven by hope and something deeper. Keanu leaned forward, the soft light from the laptop casting shadows across his face. His eyes scanned the public archives of the Film Heritage Museum site. The exhibit Maya mentioned had a dedicated listing: Voices of the Earth, Grassroots Environmental Cinema. Exhibit dates: March 3/15 of the previous year. He clicked through the description, and there it was, an itemized list of featured artifacts. Entry 17 read, "Anonymous storyboards, donated by private contributor. Believed to originate from early conceptual phase of unreleased environmental film project." Next to it, in a gray hyperlink, was a note: "Digital photo archive available upon request. Curator, Janet Ellis." Keanu clicked again. "Password protected." He paused, then opened a new tab and searched for curator contact information. A professional profile popped up with a general email address. He drafted a quick message. "Dear Miss Ellis, I'm inquiring about exhibit item 17 from last year's Voices of the Earth installation. I believe this may be connected to a legal matter currently under trial. If possible, may I request access to the archived photographs for confirmation purposes? Respectfully, Keanu Reeves." He hit send. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, a ping. A reply. It was short. "Mr. Reeves, we remember that piece well. I will grant temporary access to the archive. Link below. Regards, Janet Ellis." He clicked the link and held his breath. 20 photographs loaded. The first was a wide shot of the storyboard display mounted on soft green fabric. The handwriting was unmistakable. Keanu's curved margins, his scene transitions. One note even included the phrase, "Not for industry, grassroots only." But what stunned him most was the date in the metadata: March 7, 2010 and 48 a.m. Emin. Daniel Schur's submitted draft had been dated months after this. Vivian Cross's entire claim rested on timeline overlap. But this made that impossible. He checked another angle. A second photo clearly showed a signature at the bottom of one sketch page. K.R. Tiny, discreet, but visible. Then Keanu's face changed. His eyes narrowed. In one corner of the frame was a small brass plaque, barely readable, but it listed the advisory board members who'd helped fund and guide the curation of the exhibit. Among them, second from the top, was a familiar name: Vivian Cross. Keanu sat back in his chair, processing the implications. She hadn't just been leading the lawsuit. She had likely known about the existence of those storyboards from the beginning. Either she'd overlooked the dates entirely, or she had seen them and moved forward anyway. He grabbed his notebook and started writing. 2 columns. Column A, evidence of my original work. Exhibit 17 photos. Metadata timestamps. Maya's eyewitness account. Public listing of advisory board. Column B, possible suppression or conflict. Vivian Cross's prior role at the museum, timing of her engagement with Daniel Shore, the intern's vague testimony. This wasn't just about disproving a lie anymore. It was about proving a truth that someone powerful had gone to great lengths to bury. He looked again at Maya's journal and whispered to himself, "You did more than notice. You changed everything." The next morning, Keanu arrived at court early. He walked through the side entrance quietly, carrying only a slim file folder and Maya's handwritten journal page tucked safely inside a plastic sleeve. He passed through security and took a seat alone in the back row of the gallery. The courtroom was still mostly empty, just a few clerks arranging papers and setting microphones. His eyes scanned the room, calm but watchful. Then the door opened. Vivian Cross entered with her team, confident, poised, sharp as ever in a navy pinstripe suit. She didn't notice him at first, not until she turned to check her notes, and caught his gaze. Keanu nodded once. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. As the room filled with spectators and legal teams took their positions, Ava Monroe leaned toward Keanu and whispered, "Did you find anything last night?" Keanu gave her the briefest of smiles. The judge entered. Proceedings resumed. Vivian stood to introduce her next witness, another technical expert. But before she could speak, Keanu rose. Quietly, "Your Honor," he said, for the first time addressing the court directly, "with the court's permission, I would like to request a brief evidentiary review before this continues." Justice Hollings narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Reeves, you are represented by counsel." Ava stood beside him. "Your Honor, I support the motion. We have new material that may affect the direction of this case." Vivian objected instantly. "This is highly irregular. We're mid-testimony." But Justice Hollings lifted a hand. "I will allow it, briefly, but make it count." Keanu stepped forward, holding up a printed photograph. "This image," he said, "was taken during a public exhibition at the Film Heritage Museum, an event curated and reviewed by Ms. Cross herself." He handed a copy to the clerk to distribute. The image displayed clearly on the courtroom monitors Keanu's storyboards. Dated, photograph, and signed. A murmur spread through the audience. "Item 17, Keanu continued, "displayed March 7th of last year. Documented, verified, and time-stamped in the museum's records." He glanced toward Daniel Shore. "This predates Mr. Shore's draft by 3 months." Then he turned to Vivian Cross. "And yet, your claim hinges on a timeline where I supposedly accessed material that in fact came later. You were an advisor on the board, you saw these storyboards, and you proceeded anyway." Vivian's expression didn't change. Not yet, but her silence was loud. Keanu placed Maya's journal entry on the evidence table, then set down a small statement for the judge. "This isn't a rebuttal, it's a clarification. The truth didn't need to be defended, it just needed to be remembered." Justice Hollings looked at the evidence, then leaned back in his chair. "This court will recess for 30 minutes while I review this material in chambers." Keanu returned to his seat. Ava placed a hand on his shoulder. Vivian whispered something to her assistant, her voice tighter now, her confidence wavered. Just a crack, but it was visible. And in the back of the courtroom, Maya smiled. She knew exactly what had just happened. Keanu hadn't raised his voice, but he'd changed the entire room. Courtroom 4B was already buzzing when Keanu walked in that morning, dressed in his usual quiet black. There was no legal entourage, no assistant with him. Just the same man who had spent the previous night studying copyright clauses and reviewing a 12-year-old girl's notes like they were sworn testimony. Vivian Cross arrived 20 minutes earlier, sharp in a charcoal suit with pearled cufflinks and a stack of polished exhibits at her fingertips. Her team flanked her like a press conference waiting to happen. As she smoothed the front of her blazer, her eyes swept the room, locking on the reporters in the second row. She gave a knowing smile. This was her moment. "All rise," the bailiff called. Justice Hollings entered, nodding at both legal teams as the courtroom came to order. Before Ava Monroe could even rise, Vivian stood. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to make a short statement before we continue today's proceedings," she said, voice controlled, practiced. Justice Hollings glanced briefly toward Keanu, then nodded. "Go ahead, Ms. Cross, briefly." Vivian stepped forward with a smoothness born of hundreds of trials and thousands of camera flashes. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," she began, "we live in a time where celebrity often eclipses the rule of law. We give the benefit of the doubt not to those with evidence, but to those with the loudest following." She didn't look at Keanu directly yet. "And today we find ourselves in a courtroom because Mr. Reeves, beloved actor though he may be, believes that his fame gives him the freedom to bypass the very institutions that protect creative integrity." Now she turned to him. "Miller is a method actor pretending to be a screenwriter. He is a man whose hands are better known for holding weapons in films than for writing scripts with original ideas. And while he may charm the world with silence and smiles, this courtroom demands substance over stardom." Gasps. A few muffled chuckles. In the gallery, one man let out a snort. A wave of awkward laughter followed. Ava stood sharply. "Objection, Your Honor. This is character assassination." "Sustained," the judge said. "Miss Cross, rein it in. This isn't a press room." "My apologies," Vivian said, lips pursed. "But I felt it necessary to address the narrative unfolding outside this courtroom." The judge's face was unreadable. "Wrap it up." Vivian gave a final turn toward the jury box. "We are not here to judge a movie star. We are here to judge a case of intellectual theft. And when we strip away the lights and cameras, the facts remain. Keanu Reeves is not the author of that screenplay." She returned to her seat without a glance at him. Keanu sat quietly, no reaction, no note scribbled, no glance at the jury or gallery, just stillness. Then he rose slowly and turned toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said gently, "may I speak?" Justice Hollings raised an eyebrow. "Are you requesting to testify on your own behalf?" "Yes," Keanu said. "I believe it's time." A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Keanu Reeves had spoken only a handful of words since the trial began. Now he was asking to take the floor himself, not through his attorney, not with a prepared statement, but in his own voice. Justice Hollings adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Reeves, are you waiving legal counsel for this testimony?" Ava Monroe stood immediately. "Your Honor, we're not objecting, but we would like to reserve the right to follow up as needed after Mr. Reeves makes his remarks." "Noted," the judge replied. She looked back at Keanu. "You may proceed, but remember, this is testimony. You're under oath. Everything you say can and will be part of the record." "I understand," Keanu said. He stepped forward, not behind the stand, not toward the witness box, but just a few feet in front of his own table. He didn't carry a folder. He didn't look down. His voice was calm, not loud, but it carried. "I've been accused of stealing someone's story," he began. "That accusation isn't small to me, because stories, real stories, come from pain, from truth, from memory. They don't come easy." The courtroom was silent. No typing, no scribbles, just eyes and breath. "I met Daniel Shore once, briefly, at a workshop in Vancouver. He showed me a sketch of a script, rough, unformatted, passionate. I remember telling him to keep going, to push it forward. But I didn't take a copy. I didn't need to. I already had my own story." He turned briefly toward the jury. "You don't have to believe me yet, but I want you to know something about that story I wrote. It didn't come from a studio. It didn't come from a boardroom or a production meeting. It came from watching my mother scrub the word fairness into every page of the law books she worked with, back when she was a paralegal and raising me alone." Keanu paused, just for a moment, then he added, "She used to say, 'The law protects those who read it carefully.'" A flicker moved through the gallery, recognition, emotion. Even the judge's expression softened slightly. Keanu continued, "When I began writing my script, under a pseudonym, I did it because I wanted to tell a story about the climate crisis from the point of view of ordinary people, not astronauts or CEOs. I wrote about a woman in Montana whose family farm was swallowed by wildfire, and about how she fought, not for revenge, not for money, but for the right to stay." He looked at Vivian now, squarely. The story was mine long before it became a film, and I registered it through the proper channels months before the lawsuit you see today was filed. I have proof, and I'll present it. But what hurts more than the accusation is the idea that a person can't create without being questioned, just because they're known for doing something else. He stepped back, letting the words settle. "I'm not here to charm anyone. I'm not here to win sympathy. I'm here because the truth deserves to be said out loud, even when people laugh." Then he turned back to the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor. That's all." Justice Hollings blinked. "Do you wish to submit any evidence with your statement, Mr. Reeves?" "Yes," he said, nodding gently toward Ava. She stepped forward and handed over a document packet, sealed and time-stamped. "This folder," Keanu explained, "is the registration confirmation from the Writers Guild, dated 7 months before TechCore Studios obtained Mr. Shore's script. You'll also find a digital backup from the pseudonym account under which I submitted the work, including draft iterations, metadata, and visual storyboards." Vivian stood, her voice tight. "Your Honor, we reserve the right to challenge the validity of that pseudonym and whether Mr. Reeves was truly the author of that registration." "You'll get your chance, Ms. Cross," the judge said, already scanning the packet. Keanu returned to his seat, but he didn't lower his head. He simply looked forward, eyes calm, shoulders still. In the gallery, Maya sat on the edge of her seat, clutching her leather journal. Her father, the reporter, leaned over and whispered, "Well, he just shifted the room." She didn't answer. She was too busy scribbling something at the top of a new page. Vivian Cross paced slowly across the courtroom floor, her red heels clicking sharply against the polished tiles. The room, which had only moments ago sat in silence, was now buzzing again. But this time, the energy was different, less confident, more cautious. She paused, adjusted her tailored jacket, and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," she said crisply, "with all due respect to Mr. Reeves's eloquence, we still have a responsibility to examine the facts, not admire performances." Justice Hollings raised an eyebrow. "Proceed carefully, Ms. Cross." Vivian turned to the jury. "Let's be clear. Mr. Reeves may speak well, he may even write well, but none of that answers the central question: how did 2 scripts, one from Daniel Shore and one allegedly from Mr. Reeves, end up with near identical plot structures, scenes, and dialogue?" She let that question linger, then stepped over to the screen beside her table. "With the court's permission, I'd like to display a side-by-side breakdown of the 2 screenplays." The judge nodded. "Granted." Vivian clicked a remote. The screen lit up, displaying excerpts from both scripts. She highlighted several key lines: a character's monologue about rising tides, a confrontation at a town hall, even a scene involving a child planting a tree, almost word for word. "This," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, "is not coincidence. This is replication, adaptation without consent." Keanu remained still. Vivian turned now to Daniel Shore, who sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table. "This is the work of a young writer whose ideas were lifted and repackaged. Mr. Shore never asked for fame or fortune. He asked only to have his voice heard. And instead, he watched that voice, projected through the lens of someone far more powerful, far more connected, and yes, far more famous." She turned back toward Keanu now. "The defense wants you to believe that a WGA registration erases all suspicion, but who filed that registration? Under what name? With what timestamp? How easy would it be for someone of Mr. Reeves' stature to manipulate digital systems, bury metadata, and make himself look like the origin? Ava Monroe stood. "Objection, Your Honor, that's pure speculation." "Sustained," the judge replied sharply. "Ms. Cross, stick to what can be verified." Vivian raised her hand slightly, as if in surrender. "Of course, Your Honor." She stepped back, but her voice remained strong. "We'll examine the documents, we'll ask the hard questions, and we'll see, soon enough, who really wrote that story first." Then she returned to her seat. The judge looked toward Keanu and Ava. "Defense may respond tomorrow. We'll recess for the day." The gavel came down. Keanu stood slowly, gathered his papers, and turned to leave. But as he passed by Vivian's table, she leaned in just slightly. "You're not walking away from this one, Reeves," she whispered. "Not with charm, not with calm. You're in my arena now." Keanu looked at her for a moment, then simply said, "I've been here before." And with that, he walked on. Outside the courtroom, the press had already begun gathering. Reporters called out questions. Flashes lit the steps. Ava leaned toward Keanu. "That was a bold move, speaking today." "I didn't say everything," he replied. "Not yet." Ava nodded. "Then we better make tomorrow count." As they headed down the courthouse steps, Maya watched from behind a marble pillar. In her hand was her journal, still open, still ready. Because she had a feeling, this story wasn't just about who wrote a script. It was about something bigger, and it wasn't over yet. The courtroom, still echoing faint traces of laughter, fell quiet the moment Keanu Reeves rose to his feet. No dramatic gestures, no fury, just a calm presence as he stepped forward, carrying a single folder under one arm. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "if the court permits, I would like to speak on my own behalf." Justice Hollings tilted her head slightly. "You understand that anything you say becomes part of the official record?" "I do," Keanu nodded. "And I've prepared, carefully." Vivian Cross arched an eyebrow and smirked, but remained silent. Maybe she expected another stumble, another display of amateur fumbling. But what followed next would leave everyone in stunned silence. Keanu opened his folder and held up a highlighted sheet of paper. "I'd like to begin with U.S. copyright law, Title 17, Section 1202, he said. He took a breath and read it aloud. "In no case does copyright protection for an original work of authorship extend to any idea, procedure, process, system, method of operation, concept, principle, or discovery." A murmur spread through the crowd. "Diaz," Keanu continued, "are not protected by copyright. Only the specific expression of those ideas." He paused to let that settle. 2 years ago, in Vancouver, I met Daniel Shore. We had a passionate discussion about the climate crisis, and he shared his dream of writing a screenplay. I told him it was brave, important, and I told him to keep going. He looked at Daniel, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I never asked for his script. I never received a copy, and I never used his dialogue. What I did was write a screenplay using themes we both cared about. Environmental decay, corporate corruption, hope through small acts of resistance. Those are not his. They belong to the world. Vivian stood. "Your Honor, this is a monologue, not a defense. He is not an attorney." But Justice Hollings raised her hand. "Let him finish." Keanu opened the second flap of his folder and held up a printed photo. "This," he said, "is a photo of a public exhibit at the Pacific Film Museum, taken 9 months before Mr. Shore filed his draft." The judge squinted. "In that glass case are my original storyboards, registered under the working title Echo Forest. They include scenes, character arcs, and handwritten notes, all publicly displayed, all time-stamped." Vivian leaned forward. "Irrelevant. No legal claim was made at the time." Keanu shook his head. "But it matters, because those boards were displayed before Daniel's draft was submitted, and that means his work is not the original expression. Mine is." A stillness took over the room. Ava Monroe slowly smiled for the first time that week. Vivian clenched her jaw. "I haven't tried to silence anyone," Keanu said softly. "But I won't stay silent when truth is under attack." The judge said nothing, but her pen moved. Keanu stood a little taller. Keanu stepped back slightly, adjusting the exhibit photo on the wooden evidence stand so the judge could see the timestamp in the corner. Dated, certified, public. Then he added something else. Another document. A printed log from the museum's website, listing his storyboards as part of a temporary exhibit titled Voices for the Planet. The entry included the exact date range, 9 months before Daniel's script was filed. Justice Hollings narrowed her eyes. "Is this document authenticated?" Keanu nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The Pacific Film Museum emailed it to me yesterday evening. Their curator, Alex Mendoza, is willing to testify." A stir in the room. Even reporters had stopped typing. Vivian Cross, arms crossed now, looked more irritated than amused. But Keanu wasn't done. He turned back to face the judge. "I also discovered," he continued, "that Ms. Cross served as an advisory board member of that museum. Until last year." The courtroom froze. "Which means," he said gently, "she would have had access to that exhibit and full knowledge that those storyboards existed long before this lawsuit." Vivian stood instantly. "Objection! That's speculative." Keanu shook his head. "I'm not speculating. I'm citing her name from the museum's 2022 annual report." He placed the printed page on the table beside the photo. Page 17. Her name is listed under Strategic Legal Advisors. The judge looked down at the evidence in front of her. She didn't speak yet. "I'm not accusing anyone of malice," Keanu continued, "but I am saying that this case is built on a selective version of truth. Ms. Cross had access to evidence that contradicted her claim, and it was never presented. That should matter." Daniel Shore lowered his gaze, his knuckles tight on the edge of his seat. Vivian tried to regain control. "The fact that Mr. Reeves placed drawings in a museum does not prove authorship of a completed screenplay." Keanu stepped forward once more. "It proves that the core expression of my story, its structure, its sequence, and even some specific scenes, existed publicly and independently before Daniel submitted anything. And according to U.S. copyright law, expression must be original, not just ideas, but the tangible form they take." The judge tapped her pen again, this time slower, more deliberate. "I don't need to win this case to feel justified," Keanu said quietly. "I just want the truth on the record. I spent 2 years funding a film project that I believed in, not for profit, but for message. I refused studio deals because I didn't want it compromised. And now I'm being told I stole what I built with my own hands." He let that sit. "And I haven't spoken until now because I wanted the law to speak first." A pause. "Now it has." He returned to his seat. The courtroom remained silent. Justice Hollings leaned forward slowly, eyes scanning the museum timestamp, then the board advisory list. For a moment, she didn't look like a judge. She looked like a human being trying to reconcile 2 stories told from opposite ends of the courtroom. "Miss Cross," she said finally, "do you dispute your involvement with the museum?" Vivian straightened. "No, Your Honor, I served briefly in a non-voting advisory capacity, primarily related to donor contracts." "And were you aware of this exhibit at the time?" Vivian's lips tightened. "I was informed of several exhibitions, but I don't recall reviewing this specific one." The judge raised an eyebrow. "I suggest you refresh your memory, counselor. We are no longer discussing only creativity. We are discussing credibility." A visible shift happened in the gallery. Even Daniel Shore's lawyer whispered something into his ear. Vivian tried to pivot. "Your Honor, even if Mr. Reeves displayed some visuals, that doesn't excuse the remarkable similarities between his film and Mr. Shore's screenplay." Keanu didn't rise again. He didn't need to. Ava Monroe did. Permission to address the court briefly, Your Honor? The judge nodded. Ava walked to the center of the courtroom with calm precision. Opposing counsel just used the word remarkable. That's exactly what they are. Similarities that occur naturally between two works exploring the same environmental crisis, the same societal questions, the same hope for redemption. It's not theft, it's thematic resonance. And Mr. Reeves' work, unlike Mr. Shore's, was publicly documented long before. She returned to her seat. The judge leaned back. Court will recess for 30 minutes while I review this evidence. The gavel struck once. The room erupted. Reporters ran. Murmurs filled the air. And still Keanu sat, still and composed. A few seats behind him, Maya let out a tiny breath of pride. Her journal, zipped tight in her backpack, now felt like the most important thing she'd ever carried. Daniel Schur remained in place. His expression was no longer firm, it was lost. He looked like someone suddenly unsure who had told him the truth. As Keanu stood to stretch, Ava leaned in and whispered, "You were brilliant." He gave her a tired but grateful smile. "I didn't quote the law to win," he said. "I quoted it because I still believe in it." Outside the courthouse, the media swirled, but inside, the courtroom was quiet again. Except for one faint sound, Vivian Cross's pen scribbling furiously across a legal pad. It no longer looked like confidence. It looked like retreat. The room held its breath as Keanu rose once more, his tone still gentle, his eyes unwavering. "Your Honor," he said, "if I may, I'd like to call a final witness. Someone who can clarify the timeline that has come under such heavy scrutiny." There was a ripple of curiosity through the gallery. Vivian Cross narrowed her eyes, just as Hollings adjusted her glasses. "Proceed, Mr. Reeves." Keanu stepped aside, motioning toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom. They opened slowly. A silver-held man in a tailored blazer walked down the aisle, clutching a thick portfolio under one arm. He moved with measured calm, his demeanor scholarly. When he reached the stand, Keanu gave a respectful nod. "This is Dr. Elliot Mendez," Keanu said. "He is the senior curator of the Pacific Northwest Film Heritage Museum in Vancouver." Ava Monroe stood. "Dr. Mendez, were you involved in the installation and supervision of a public exhibit titled Narratives of Change, Environmental Cinema and the Future in March of last year?" "I was," Mendez confirmed. "I oversaw every piece that went into the exhibit, including a series of original hand-drawn storyboards donated anonymously under the name C.R. Gardens." Ava nodded. "And did those storyboards belong to Mr. Keanu Reeves?" "Yes," Mendez replied. "We later confirmed the identity of the donor. Mr. Reeves visited us personally in January, prior to the March opening, to review the framing and display." The courtroom stirred. Justice Hollings leaned forward. "And what was the subject of those storyboards?" Ava asked. Mendez opened his portfolio. Inside were laminated pages with high-resolution photos of the museum's storyboard wall. They depicted the thematic structure of a short film titled Still Seasons, later developed into a feature-length screenplay. It featured a fictional coastal village, a non-linear time structure tied to environmental loss, and a silent child protagonist, elements that now appear in the script Mr. Shore claims as his own. "Do you have a verified date for when these were on public display?" Ava asked. "March 2nd, 4 full months before Mr. Shore submitted his draft to any studio." At that, Vivian stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is highly circumstantial. The exhibit was public. Thousands of visitors came through." Keanu finally turned to her. "Did you?" Vivian crossed her arms. "No, I did not attend that exhibit." A beat. Keanu's voice was soft but firm. "Dr. Mendez, do you keep a guest book or visitor record?" "We do. And in our digital records," Mendez said, pulling out a printed page, "we have a scanned signature from March 18th, Vivian Cross, in cursive, just before the curator's tour." Gasps rippled through the room. Vivian's voice was icy. Coincidence. That doesn't prove I saw anything. Justice Hollings raised a hand. Let's allow the record to speak first. Then, unexpectedly, from the gallery, a young voice rose. She saw it. I have proof. All heads turned. It was Maya, the 12-year-old film student, stood up slowly, holding her leather-bound journal in both hands. Maya stepped forward, her hands trembling just slightly as she clutched the worn leather journal. She looked to her father, who froze in place. He whispered her name, but she didn't stop. She walked slowly toward the front, the courtroom utterly silent. Even Vivian didn't move. Everyone was watching the small girl with the dark hair and steady eyes. Justice Hollings leaned forward. Young lady, do you understand where you are? Maya nodded. Yes, Your Honor. My name is Maya Patel. I'm 12 years old. My school visited the Pacific Northwest Film Heritage Museum last year. During that exhibit, Justice Hollings looked toward Keanu and Ava. Counsel, is this witness known to you? Keanu took a step forward. Yes, Your Honor. Maya spoke to me in the hallway 2 days ago. She brought this journal with her. I've reviewed it. I believe what she holds may clarify the truth. Hollings looked at Vivian, who gave a tight-lipped shrug. Proceed, the judge said. Maya opened the journal to a page marked with a green ribbon. This was from our field trip. I love sketching, so I drew some of the exhibits. And I drew her. She pointed to the sketch. That's Ms. Cross. I didn't know who she was at the time, but she was standing near the storyboards writing something down. Gasps echoed across the gallery. Ava walked over and gently took the journal, holding it up for the court to see. There it was, a surprisingly detailed pencil sketch of the museum wall, the distinctive frames of the storyboard exhibit, and a sharply outlined figure with high heels, a cropped blazer, and a notepad in her hand. Her name wasn't labeled, but the face, drawn in side profile, was unmistakably Vivian Cross. Vivian's face was pale now. She opened her mouth, but the judge raised her hand again. Ms. Patel, said Justice Hollings, did anyone ask you to draw this? No, Your Honor. I draw everything. My dad's a reporter. He told me to write things down I notice. Justice Hollings gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the journal. We'll submit this into evidence as Exhibit 37. She looked over the sketch closely. Remarkably detailed. And time-stamped. Maya nodded. My teacher made us date every page. Keanu turned back to the courtroom. Your Honor, this confirms that not only were my storyboards on public display months before Daniel's draft, but that Ms. Cross saw them, despite her sworn statement to the contrary. Vivian stood slowly. This is a child's drawing, not a legal document. Hollings fixed her with a sharp stare. Perhaps not, but it is corroborated by museum records, visitor logs, and the testimony of Dr. Mendez. The fact that you denied even being present, when your signature and now this sketch place you there, casts doubt on your credibility. Vivian remained silent, her jaw clenched tightly. From the gallery, Maya's father looked both horrified and stunned. He had no idea his daughter had just shifted the entire course of the trial. Justice Hollings tapped her gavel once, not in reprimand, but to still the rustle of whispers. Her eyes returned to Vivian. Ms. Cross, you stated under oath that you had never seen Mr. Reeves' storyboards. Would you like to revise your statement? Vivian inhaled slowly, her voice tight. I did not recall being there at the time. If records now place me at the museum, it must have been in passing. Ava stood immediately. Your Honor, with all due respect, that is a deliberate evasion. The witness under oath gave false testimony regarding a central piece of the timeline, and we now have visual evidence, drawn by an uninvolved observer, that contradicts her. Vivian's co-counsel whispered something urgently in her ear, but she ignored him. Her eyes were fixed on Keanu now, and for the first time since the trial began, she looked genuinely shaken. Objection sustained, Hollings said. The court acknowledges that the journal corroborates Mr. Reeves' account of his prior public display and introduces doubt regarding the plaintiff's legal counsel's credibility. Ms. Monroe, do you intend to move forward with a motion based on this? Ava nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We request immediate consideration of a motion to dismiss the claim based on misrepresentation of key facts and newly submitted exculpatory evidence. The judge nodded solemnly. I will recess briefly to review the motion. She looked to Maya, who stood still, clutching the edge of her seat. Miss Patel, thank you for your bravery and for paying attention when others didn't. Maya smiled faintly and returned to her father's side. He whispered something in her ear, eyes glistening with a mix of shock and pride. She simply wrote something down in her journal and closed it carefully. Vivian sat back in her chair, no longer the composed architect of a flawless prosecution. Her hands twitched slightly. Behind her, Daniel Shore lowered his head, staring at his own shoes. No one was whispering to him now. Keanu leaned over to Ava and whispered, It's almost over. She nodded, watching the judge's chamber's door close behind Justice Hollings. In the momentary stillness, Keanu looked to Maya and gave her a small nod of thanks. She beamed. The entire courtroom sat on the edge of silence, suspended in the weight of what had just unfolded. A child's memory, a sketch, a lie revealed. The story had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. Across the courtroom, the mural of justice etched above the judge's bench caught the light, and below it sat a man who never raised his voice, a lawyer who never raised her hand, and a girl who quietly raised the truth. What would the judge decide? That answer was only minutes away. The air in the courtroom was still charged from Maya's journal revelation. Silence reigned for a beat too long, until Justice Hollings, eyes narrowed, slowly leaned forward. Ms. Cross, would you like to revise your testimony? Her voice was calm but razor-sharp. Vivian didn't answer. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her gaze locked on the sketch of herself in Maya's notebook, unmistakably positioned next to Keanu's exhibit. Her usual composure wavered for the first time. Before the tension could stretch further, Ava Monroe stood. She carried a thin stack of papers in one hand, her expression unreadable but steady. Your Honor, she said, with the court's permission, the defense would like to introduce additional documentation, emails, meeting records, and internal memos from TechCore Studios. The judge gestured. Proceed. Ava moved methodically to the center of the courtroom, her tone never rising, yet somehow commanding the attention of every single person in the room. These documents were obtained through a court-approved subpoena. They outline meetings held between TechCore executives and Ms. Cross, dating back 6 months before this lawsuit was filed. She handed a copy to the clerk, then continued. In these records, TechCore refers to Mr. Reeves' independent film as a market disruptor. They label the project as a threat to their own in-development feature, which, notably, shares similar environmental themes. A flicker of recognition passed over Daniel Shore's face, barely visible unless one was looking closely. Ava lifted another sheet. In this memo, labeled confidential, a TechCore legal consultant outlines a strategy. And I quote, pressure the original workshop writer, present an IP theft narrative using industry connections, delay Reeves' distribution until Q4, neutralize indie competition. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Vivian stood abruptly. Objection, this is speculative. Justice Hollings raised her hand. Overruled. These are your client's internal documents, Ms. Cross. Ava moved on calmly. And then we have this. She held up a final page. A consulting contract between Miss Vivian Cross and TechCore Studios, signed 2 months before the lawsuit was filed. Payment for services rendered, $125,000. The document was passed to the judge, who examined it in silence. Vivian's face was pale now. Her hands, once clasped confidently, now trembled ever so slightly at her sides. Daniel Shore's eyes darted between the judge, Ava, and Vivian. His breath was quick, shallow. His posture collapsed inward like a balloon slowly deflating. "Mr. Shore," Ava said gently, "were you aware of Ms. Cross's financial ties to TechCore when you agreed to pursue this lawsuit?" Daniel looked down at his hands. For a moment he said nothing. Then he cleared his throat. "No, not at first," he said quietly. She said I had a real case, that Keanu Reeves had stolen my chance." He swallowed. "I trusted her." Vivian took a step toward him, her voice sharp. "Daniel?" But he raised a hand. "Jean told me that even if it wasn't cut and dry, it wouldn't matter, that the court of public opinion would do the rest." His voice cracked. "I just wanted my film to be seen. I didn't want all this." Justice Hollings leaned back slowly, brows furrowed in thought. "You're saying you were misled into filing this suit under false pretenses?" Daniel nodded, eyes brimming. "Yes, Your Honor. I was manipulated." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but the judge quickly called for silence. Keanu remained seated, arms crossed, eyes soft as he watched Daniel. No anger, just a kind of quiet understanding. The storm had shifted, but the aftermath was just beginning. Justice Hollings sat silently for a long moment. Then she removed her glasses, folding them gently in her lap. "I'm placing this court in recess for 30 minutes, she said, her voice firm. "During that time, I will review the submitted materials and determine whether this case should proceed." The gavel struck once, and the room exhaled all at once. People rose from their benches, whispering furiously. Vivian Cross didn't move. Her heels were rooted to the floor, lips pressed together in a tight line as she stared ahead. Her mask finally cracking. Ava turned to Keanu, her voice soft but energized. "We did it. Or at least, we broke through." But Keanu just nodded slowly. Daniel told the truth. That's what mattered. At the far end of the room, Daniel Shore remained seated, his head in his hands. He looked smaller somehow, like a boy who had wandered into a fire, thinking it was just warm light. A court officer stood nearby, watching him, not as a threat, but as someone who had just stepped onto very thin legal ice. Maya sat still in the gallery, her journal now clutched tightly to her chest. Her father was furiously typing notes on his laptop beside her. He leaned toward her and whispered, "I owe you an apology." She raised her eyebrows. "You saw it before I did," he said. "The museum, the sketch, everything. That wasn't just luck. You noticed what nobody else did." Maya beamed, then quickly composed herself as the judge's assistant signaled for everyone to return to their seats. 30 minutes had vanished in a blink. Justice Hollings returned, her robe flowing as she took the bench again. "This court has reviewed the newly submitted documents," she began, eyes focused directly on Vivian Cross, "and finds them not only credible, but deeply troubling." She looked to Daniel. "Mr. Shore, the court recognizes your statement of remorse. Based on the evidence, it appears you were indeed misled by outside interests that deliberately intended to weaponize this courtroom for corporate sabotage." Daniel's chin trembled. He nodded but said nothing. Then the judge turned her gaze on Vivian. "Ms. Cross," she said, her tone now icy, "it appears you were not simply counsel, but a concealed actor in this strategy. The court has reviewed your signed consulting contract with TechCore Studios, including the compensation structure that incentivized suppression of a competing creative work. You did not disclose this conflict of interest when presenting yourself as an impartial representative of Mr. Shore." Vivian finally spoke, but her voice had lost all authority. "Your Honor, I acted within the bounds of legal strategy. My affiliations—" "Were not disclosed," the judge interrupted sharply. "This is not merely an ethical lapse, this is a breach of trust that undermines the very structure of this court. I am referring this matter to the State Bar for immediate review." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Vivian Cross closed her eyes. Furthermore, Justice Hollings continued, this court will dismiss the complaint brought against Mr. Reeves in full, with prejudice. The lawsuit is hereby terminated. The gavel slammed down a second time. Silence, then a murmur, then applause from the gallery, from reporters, from a few fellow attorneys who, despite their professionalism, couldn't suppress the relief. Keanu didn't move at first. He just sat still, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he stood, not triumphant, not smug, just thankful. He turned toward Daniel, offering a simple nod. Daniel rose shakily and returned it. Ava touched Keanu's arm. We'll talk to the press later. But Keanu just looked out over the courtroom and whispered, they already saw the real story. He glanced up toward the gallery. Maya smiled down at him, and this time he smiled back. Justice had been served, but more than that, the truth had found its voice. Keanu stood from his seat with the same quiet calm he had maintained since the trial began. His suit was simple, black, understated. His face carried a quiet intensity, clear eyes, thoughtful expression, no need to raise his voice. When Justice Hollings gave a slight nod, the courtroom fell into a hushed stillness. Even Vivian Cross didn't speak. No more interruptions. It was his time, including his wife. He began slowly, choosing each word with care. I never wanted this to become a spectacle, he said. When I began writing the story that became Ashes of the Green, it wasn't with awards in mind. It wasn't for box office numbers or streaming contracts. It was because I met a girl in British Columbia who asked me why trees were disappearing faster than her friends could name them. I didn't have an answer. He paused, but I knew I had to start looking for one. And stories help us look. Reporters' pens slowed. Even the court officer near the back lowered his hand from the holster he always rested on. Keanu wasn't giving a statement. He was telling a story. His voice, measured and sincere, settled like soft rain in the room. 2 years ago, I visited a community film workshop in Vancouver. It was cold that day. Everyone inside the little rec hall had their coats on, shivering as they talked about character arcs and lighting setups. That's where I met Daniel. He showed me an early outline. It was raw, personal. I remember telling him that his voice mattered. He turned to look at Daniel, who dropped his gaze. I never took that outline. I didn't need to. What I carried with me from that day wasn't dialogue or beats or formatting. It was the ache of wanting the world to listen before it burned. A soft shift in the gallery. The sound of someone exhaling deeply. Storytelling is a strange thing, Keanu continued. You borrow pieces of people, of moments, and you try to stitch together something that might make someone pause, maybe cry, maybe change. But the moment we start turning that into a battleground, when we weaponize creativity to silence others, we forget what stories are for. He looked down briefly, almost as if collecting himself. Some of you might think I'm trying to win a case. I'm not. I've lost things far more precious than a screenplay. People I love. Time I can't get back. What I'm trying to do is protect a promise. That promise is this, that the truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. He stepped slightly forward. My mother worked as a paralegal. She raised me to understand the value of words. Words you agree to, words that protect you, words that bind people across time. She used to say, the law protects those who read it carefully, but it honors those who live it with integrity. I didn't go to law school, but I've read, I've listened, and I believe the law, like storytelling, is a vessel for something bigger than all of us. Then, in the quietest tone yet, he added, sometimes the loudest thing you can say is written in silence. Justice Hollings blinked slowly, her expression unreadable. Vivian stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. Ava Monroe gave no smile, no nod, just a stillness that reflected deep respect. Even Maya, seated behind her father, sat unmoving. Her journal lay open in her lap, the words she'd written hours ago now eclipsed by something more powerful. A voice not raised, but revealed. Keanu remained at the front of the courtroom, his hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't posturing, he wasn't performing. He simply stood there, grounded, honest. And then he continued, voice steady as ever. "I didn't come here today to convince you I'm innocent," he said, addressing the judge but letting his eyes pass gently across the courtroom. "I came here to show that this story, this fight, isn't about me at all. It's about something much deeper." He gestured toward the counsel table, where his legal notes sat beside a worn legal text. "We talk about authorship like it's ownership. But true authorship isn't just about who types the words, it's about who lives them. The truth is, I've been living this story, this idea, for most of my adult life. My choices, my actions, the projects I fund quietly, the communities I support, they're all rooted in the belief that art should do more than entertain. It should remind us what still matters." Then he paused, letting the moment breathe. "There was a line in Daniel's original concept," he continued softly, "that stayed with me. It said, 'What if the last thing we ever hear is our own silence?' That line wasn't about nature or politics. It was about us, about whether we can still listen." Daniel looked up, visibly shaken. His fingers clutched the edge of the table, as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. Keanu turned toward the gallery. "Last week someone handed me a journal, a 12-year-old girl who remembered more than the adults in the room. She remembered what we taught her in school, that truth matters, that courage counts, that showing up for what's right, even when no one listens, is still worth doing. Her name is Maya. She reminded me why I wrote this film in the first place." Maya blinked fast, holding back tears. "I'm not here to defeat anyone," Keanu said. "I'm not here to win headlines or make an example out of anyone in this room. I'm here to reclaim something that has been lost in too many industries, too many courts, too many boardrooms. Integrity." He looked once more at Vivian Cross. She didn't flinch, but her face had changed, tightened in the way a dam begins to tremble before the water breaks through. "You accused me of hiding behind my fame. You said I was using celebrity as a shield. But what you don't know is that the shield you're talking about comes with scars. It doesn't protect me from scrutiny, it makes me easier to target. I didn't choose silence because I'm afraid to speak. I chose it because I wanted to speak only when it mattered." He took one small step closer to the bench. "And I believe it matters now." There was a pause, no coughs, no whispers. Even the clicking of the court reporter's keys had quieted. Keanu gently set his notepad on the edge of the witness rail. "This," he said, "isn't a monologue, it's a record. Not just of what's happened, but of who we choose to be when things get difficult." Then, with a small bow of his head, he concluded, "And if this court finds against me, I will still walk away knowing I told the truth, with respect, with grace, and with the silence that speaks when words are no longer enough." He returned to his seat. No applause followed, just the kind of silence that lingered like fog, dense, heavy, unforgettable, the kind that made people think, the kind that echoed longer than any argument ever could. The courtroom was still as Judge Hollings returned from chambers. Her glasses sat low on the bridge of her nose, and the silence that followed her entrance felt heavier than it had all week. Everyone rose, then sat, then waited. She looked over the files before her, her expression unreadable. "After reviewing the testimony, evidence, and procedural concerns raised in this matter," she began, her voice clear but solemn, "this court finds that the copyright infringement claim brought against Mr. Keanu Reeves is without merit." A quiet gasp swept through the courtroom. Maya nearly jumped out of her seat but stayed still, her hands gripping her leather journal so tightly the edges curled. The photographic timeline, museum testimony, and witness statements clearly establish prior art and independent development, Judge Hollings continued. Furthermore, the role of external pressure on the plaintiff calls into question the integrity of the claim. Vivian Cross's jaw tightened. Her arms crossed slowly, a subtle tell. She didn't look up. Judge Hollings went on. This court will also be submitting a formal ethics review to the State Bar in regard to Ms. Cross's failure to disclose her connection to TechCore Studios during these proceedings. The nature of her advisory role, paired with the direct conflict of interest, raises serious concerns. Vivian finally blinked. The shock was visible, but she said nothing. As for TechCore Studios, the judge added, this court is formally recommending referral to the Attorney General's office for review of their tactics, including the possibility of corporate manipulation and witness coercion. A civil suit may follow. Reporters were already scribbling. Cameras in the hallway would be waiting. The biggest legal scandal in entertainment that year had just reached its apex. Keanu, however, remained seated, still and quiet. Ava touched his arm gently, as if giving permission to react, but he only gave a slow nod. It wasn't victory in the way people usually imagined it. It was something simpler, quieter. The judge banged her gavel once. This hearing is concluded. Court is adjourned. The room erupted, journalists flooding the aisle, flashes going off, microphones being thrust forward before Keanu had even stood. He stood anyway. A young reporter with an oversized press badge leaned in, breathless. Mr. Reeves, do you have a statement? How do you feel? Keanu looked past the cameras, past the frenzy, to the girl in the third row who hadn't stopped believing in the truth when even the adults around her had. Maya. He stepped down, walked toward her. Security instinctively moved, but paused as he gave them a small nod. Maya stood frozen. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a pen, and gently tapped her journal. May I? He asked. She handed it to him, wide-eyed. He flipped to a blank page near the back and, in clear handwriting, wrote one line. Keep noticing what others miss. Then handed it back with a smile that said everything words couldn't. Maya clutched it to her chest, the courtroom noise disappearing behind her like a distant tide. Keanu didn't stay for the interviews, didn't raise his arms or speak into the microphones. He simply turned and walked out the side door, his attorney close behind. But Maya's face glowed with something even brighter than vindication. Validation. Not just that they had won, but that noticing, caring, paying attention. Those things mattered. Upside the courthouse, the sidewalk was packed. News vans lined the curb. Reporters stood on crates, shouting into microphones. The words Reeves, trial, and Vivian Cross were everywhere, on screens, lips, and hastily printed paper banners flapping in the wind. But Keanu Reeves wasn't there. He exited through the side of the building, away from the cameras, away from the noise. Only a few people noticed. One was Maya, still gripping her journal like a relic. Another was Daniel Shore, standing near a column, unsure whether to speak. When Keanu saw him, he stopped. Daniel looked down, then up. I didn't know what I was getting into, he said quietly. I never meant for it to go this far. Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable but not angry. I know, he replied. Daniel glanced at the ground. I should have come to you. Told the truth sooner. You did today, Keanu said. A long pause passed between them. Daniel pulled something from his jacket pocket. A folded sheet of paper. This was the original draft, the one I was working on before I ever met TechCore. There's barely anything in here that matches your film. They just told me they'd make it happen if I let them lead. Keanu unfolded the page, read it, then handed it back. You're a writer, he said. Start writing again. Daniel's eyes welled up, but Keanu was already walking away. Across the street, a small crowd had begun to realize he was there. A few fans rushed forward. A couple reporters called his name. But Keanu didn't stop. Instead, he disappeared into a waiting car. Windows up, engine quiet, no entourage. At the far end of the courthouse plaza, Maya stood next to her father, who was frantically typing a new headline into his laptop. "Why didn't he say anything to the press?" Maya asked. Leo paused. "Because he didn't have to. He already said what mattered. To you." She looked down at her journal, still open to the page he signed. "Keep noticing what others miss." As they walked away, Leo turned to her. "You know, we never did celebrate your birthday properly." "It's okay," she said. "Today was better than cake." He smiled. "Next weekend, we'll go anywhere you want." "Can we go to the library at the film museum?" she asked. He stopped walking and looked at her with mock shock. "You're choosing the museum over pizza?" "Just for an hour," she said, grinning. "I want to look through the old exhibit logs, see if they saved the full storyboard archive." He nodded. "You're definitely your mother's daughter." That night, Maya placed the journal on her shelf, next to a photo of her mom. She didn't know where life would take her yet. She didn't know if she'd be a director, a writer, or just someone who liked stories. But she knew one thing for sure. She had witnessed something real, and not just in the verdict, but in how a quiet man defended truth, not with anger, but with presence, not with volume, but with clarity. Keanu never tried to win the court of public opinion. He just told the truth, and in the end, it was enough. The night air held a quiet reverence as the lights dimmed inside the Old Town Theater, nestled between redwoods and a local organic bakery. A handmade banner fluttered above the entrance, Pacific Earth Film Festival, Stories That Heal. It wasn't Cannes, it wasn't Sundance, but every seat was filled, not with celebrities or critics, but with students, scientists, teachers, and storytellers, the kind of people Keanu had always wanted to reach. Maya sat between her dad and her best friend Lucy, wearing a hoodie far too big for her frame, the hood pulled so low it almost covered her eyes. But she was smiling, nervous, excited. She could hardly believe she was here. Her leather journal was tucked in her lap. The page with Keanu's signature folded open like a secret she read 100 times. Daniel Shore sat 6 rows back, alone, hands clasped, back straight. His beard had grown slightly. He looked thinner, quieter. He wasn't on any guest list and no camera had noticed him. But he had come. He had wanted to see the finished film, not to compare or critique, just to listen. The lights on the stage warmed to life as a quiet piano melody played. A woman with silver earrings welcomed the audience and introduced the evening's speaker, Keanu Reeves. He stepped into the light in a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms, no script in hand. He didn't need one. Keanu looked out at the faces before him, then spoke slowly. This film started as a whisper, just an idea about what the earth remembers when we forget to listen. He paused, scanning the crowd. His eyes briefly found Maya's. She ducked deeper into her hood. But along the way, something unexpected happened. The story was nearly lost, nearly rewritten. It took more than contracts or cameras to protect it. It took people. He turned and gestured off stage. One of them is here tonight. She's 12. She doesn't work in film, doesn't work in law, but she paid attention when others didn't. Maya's eyes widened. "Would you join me, Maya?" The room hushed as all heads turned toward her. She froze. Her dad looked at her with the gentlest nod. Keanu held out a hand. She stood slowly, hoodie pulled tighter, journal clutched in her arms, and walked up the short steps, onto the soft wooden stage. Keanu leaned down and whispered something no one could hear. Maya nodded, her cheeks crimson. He guided her to center stage. "This is Maya," he said. "She saw something no one else did, and she reminded us that truth is rarely loud. It's just brave." Applause broke out, not thunderous, but warm. Human. Maya tucked her head deeper into her hoodie, half hiding, half glowing. Keanu turned back to her, smiled once more, and walked off stage. The screen behind her faded from black to a single image, an old tree growing through cracked concrete. The opening scene began. Maya returned to her seat. Her dad squeezed her hand once, and beside the projection room door, Daniel stood in the shadows, his eyes wet, whispering to no one. That's what it was supposed to be. The film unfolded without spectacle, just quiet power. It told the story of a man returning to the burned ruins of his childhood home after a wildfire, only to uncover audio tapes left behind by his late mother, a forest ecologist. The tapes, full of field notes and memories, slowly stitched together a mosaic of grief, rebirth, and the fragile, aching resilience of nature. The room was still. No popcorn, no shifting seats, just breaths being held in unison. At one point, Maya wiped her face with her sleeve, not from nerves, but from a line whispered in the film as the main character stood in a field of ash. "We don't inherit the earth. We inherit each other's silence." She glanced over at her dad. He wasn't a man who cried often, but his jaw was clenched and his eyes were glassy. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Behind them, Daniel's heart sank and rose all at once. He recognized pieces of himself in the imagery. The workshop conversations he'd once had with Keanu, yes, but more so, he recognized something that was never his. Something beyond any script. A truth carried in tone, not text. When the credits rolled, there was no thunderous ovation. Only that rare, beautiful thing that happens when art hits bone. Stillness. Reverence. Then a ripple of applause. Then more, until everyone stood. On screen, the final words appeared against a fading photograph of a moss-covered hiking trail. For those who protected the story. Maya stared at the screen. She didn't blink. Her dad rested a hand on her shoulder. Backstage, Keanu stepped aside, letting the cast take their bows. He didn't return to the spotlight. Instead, he watched from behind the curtain. He wasn't looking at the actors. He was watching the audience. Watching Maya. Watching Daniel. Later, after the house lights rose and the audience slowly filed out, Keanu returned to the lobby. No cameras, no stage, just warm light and folding chairs. Daniel found him first. For a moment, they just stood there, two artists on opposite sides of a storm that had passed. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly, "for all of it. I should have asked more questions before signing anything." Keanu didn't offer a lecture. He just nodded. "I think you were scared," he said. Daniel looked down. "I was. You wrote from a place of truth." "That's worth something," Keanu added. "I still want to write," Daniel said. "Then write," Keanu replied. "But protect it this time. Not from others. From your own fear." Daniel didn't speak again. He simply reached out, and Keanu shook his hand. Across the room, Maya stood near a table lined with brochures from local conservation groups. She wasn't speaking. She was drawing in her journal. Keanu walked over and knelt beside her. "You still carry that thing everywhere, huh?" She smiled. "It sees more than I do." "Maybe," Keanu said, "but it doesn't get stage fright." She laughed, just a little. He opened the journal and pointed to a sketch she'd done months ago. A rough but honest drawing of a courtroom, and in the back row, a small figure raising her hand. "You didn't know anyone would listen," he said, "but you still spoke." Maya looked at the page, then back at him. "I didn't want the story to get taken." Keanu nodded. "Neither did I." Then, quietly, he pulled something from his pocket. A folded piece of thick paper, aged at the corners, a storyboard sketch. The very first one he ever drew for the film. It showed a single frame, a young girl holding a tape recorder under a tree. "For your journal," he said. Maya took it like it was made of glass. The festival director walked by, calling out congratulations to Keanu. A reporter from a local environmental blog tried to approach. Keanu waved them off, gently. Tonight wasn't about statements. It wasn't about verdicts. It was about returning the story to where it began, in the hands of those who noticed. The trial had ended, but its echoes reached far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Within weeks, law schools across the country began discussing the case of Keanu v. Reeves as a modern turning point in how intellectual property law intersects with celebrity influence and independent media. The case was dissected in ethics seminars, copyright debates, and mock trials. Professors praised its complexity. Students argued passionately on both sides. But the most unexpected moment came when Keanu Reeves's testimony, especially his phrase about truth written in silence, was printed in the Harvard Law Review. They called it the poetry of justice. At Maya's middle school, things changed too. She went from being a quiet film club member to someone whose name was now whispered with awe in the hallways. Her dad tried to keep it low profile, but reporters kept calling. She turned them all down, except one invitation, from her school principal. "Would you be willing to speak at next month's assembly?" he asked gently. "Just tell your side, what it felt like to help." Maya hesitated. "I'm not really a speaker." But something inside her, maybe the same spark that had made her speak up in the courtroom, nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll try." The auditorium was packed that day. Students, teachers, even parents filled the folding chairs. Maya stood at the podium with her leather journal in her hand, fidgeting with the corner of the cover. She glanced at the crowd, then at the small rocket pin on her sleeve, a gift from Keanu after the trial. And then, without notes, she spoke. "I saw something that didn't make sense, and I said something, that's all." The room held still, silent, and breathless. She took a deep breath. "And even though I was scared, even though I thought no one would care, I wrote it down anyway. I guess sometimes writing it down is where courage starts." After her speech, the school gave her a standing ovation. Later that week, Keanu sent a handwritten letter to her school, commending Maya's courage and announcing something else: a youth film scholarship in her name. It would be called the Maya Ward Scholarship for Emerging Storytellers. The fund would cover tuition and mentorship programs for middle and high school filmmakers from underserved communities. Maya's classmates cheered when the news spread. But Maya? She sat quietly in the hallway, tears welling in her eyes, not from attention, but from the idea that someone, somewhere, might now have a chance to tell their story, because she'd told hers. Meanwhile, Vivian Cross vanished from the public spotlight. Her website went offline, her law firm removed her name from its history, and a brief notice appeared in a legal journal announcing she had resigned all affiliations pending an independent ethics review. But in back channels, quiet discussions grew. Keanu's team had discovered that TechCore Studios had filed similar copyright complaints in the past against 3 other indie filmmakers whose projects never saw release. One of those cases had disappeared quietly. Another had settled under a strict non-disclosure agreement, and one, curiously, had been dismissed for lack of jurisdiction, though the details were sealed. Keanu's lawyer, Ava Monroe, began quietly gathering records. There was a pattern. TechCore didn't just buy scripts, they buried them. And sometimes they buried the people behind them too. But what Ava found next changed everything. A sealed deposition from 2 years earlier involving TechCore's executive counsel and an anonymous whistleblower. The whistleblower had warned of a campaign to suppress independent environmental content that conflicted with TechCore's media holdings. That campaign had a name: Project Eclipse. Ava Monroe read the words again. Project Eclipse. It sounded like something from a dystopian film, but the details were chillingly real. According to the sealed testimony, TechCore Studios had been running a strategic initiative for 3 years. Its objective was to quietly identify small independent films, especially those dealing with climate change, resource ethics, or whistleblowing, and either absorb them through legal acquisition or derail them through litigation. The purpose? To maintain control over the public narrative and eliminate media that might undermine their more profitable, mass distribution projects. And Vivian Cross, though no longer on any official payroll, had consulted on every case listed in the program's timeline. Ava forwarded the information to Keanu in a password-locked document. Within minutes, he called her. "How much of this can we prove in court?" he asked. Ava's tone was cautious. "Enough to push for an inquiry, maybe more, if the whistleblower is willing to come forward again." Keanu didn't speak for a few moments. Then he said, "Then we shine a light on what they tried to keep in the dark." But he wasn't interested in a press tour. Instead, Keanu partnered with a group of filmmakers, journalists, and lawyers to create something different. They called it the Eclipse Project, reclaiming the name from those who tried to weaponize it. It became a collaborative platform where emerging creators could share their stories without fear of corporate suppression. Donations flowed in from artists, activists, and even anonymous donors moved by the court case's outcome. And Maya? She became one of its youngest contributors. Her short film, made with her school's camera and a script she wrote in the margins of her science notebook, was called Signal Through Smoke. It was about a girl who witnesses something small, like a single light flickering in the distance, and decides to follow it even when no one believes her. The film was selected for a National Youth Storytelling Summit. Keanu introduced it himself. He didn't say much. Just, sometimes, the smallest voice carries the truth. The crowd applauded. Maya, sitting beside her dad, clutched her rocket pin and blinked away the emotion. Elsewhere, whispers continued. TechCore's stock dropped sharply as rumors of an investigation began to circulate. Several executives quietly stepped down. A former assistant leaked internal memos to a journalist at The Atlantic. And on a cold January morning, the Department of Justice opened a preliminary inquiry into intellectual property manipulation and anti-competitive practices in the entertainment industry. Vivian Cross never resurfaced publicly, but some believed she had fled the country. Others said she was quietly negotiating immunity, and a few, mostly former colleagues, claimed she was simply waiting for public memory to fade. But public memory didn't fade, because in classrooms, law schools, and even middle school film clubs, the story of Maya, Keanu, and the courtroom that almost silenced a truth but didn't, kept being told. And in that way, the story kept protecting itself. Forever written, forever noticed, forever heard. The soft echo of Keanu Reeves's boots followed him down the quiet hallway of the university's film department. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long lines across the floor. Students whispered when they saw him pass, but Keanu offered only a small nod. He hadn't come here as a celebrity. He'd come as someone who had something to say. Inside the seminar room, rows of students filled the seats. At the front stood Professor Elena Cartwright, a thoughtful woman with gray-streaked braids and glasses perched low on her nose. She waited as the buzz quieted. "Some of you may know him as an actor," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But today, I introduce him as something else, an artist who outwitted a system designed to silence the quiet." She stepped back. "Mr. Reeves, the floor is yours." Keanu approached the podium, gripping the edges for a brief moment before letting go. He didn't need notes, not for this. "I've spent most of my life reciting words written by others," he began. "But when someone tried to erase what I wrote, I had to learn to speak for myself." He paused, scanning the room. There's a moment in every story, real or imagined, when the main character has to choose, speak up or walk away. I almost walked away. Not because I was afraid of losing, but because I didn't want to be part of the noise. He glanced toward the window. But silence, he continued, isn't always peace. Sometimes silence is just permission. The room remained still. I was accused of stealing a story, he said, and not by strangers, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. People who thought they could bury the truth beneath paperwork, contracts, and noise. He looked out over the students, eyes steady. But they forgot something. The truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it's drawn in pencil by a 12-year-old girl who noticed what others didn't. A murmur passed through the room. Many of them had read about the trial. They remembered Maya. Some had even written essays on the case for their ethics final. Keanu continued, his voice low and even. I'm not here to teach you how to write a screenplay or how to fight a courtroom battle. I'm here to remind you that your voice matters, even when it shakes, especially when it shakes. He stepped back slightly, breathing in, as if grounding himself before saying what came next. Because when the moment comes, and it will, you'll face your own scene, and in that moment you'll have to decide, will you be the one who protects the story, or the one who lets someone else rewrite it for you? The classroom stayed silent, but not empty, the kind of silence that holds weight. Reverence. A few students leaned forward, hanging onto every word. Keanu placed both hands lightly on the table beside him. I want to tell you something I didn't say in court, he said. Something that stayed with me when the cameras left and the verdict was done. He looked down for a moment, then back up. I wrote that film, my version, not because I wanted credit or even because I thought it would sell. I wrote it because I believed in it. I believed in the people it was about, in the message it carried. It wasn't entertainment. It was a warning, a reflection, a hope. His voice softened. I never thought I'd need to defend it like a piece of evidence. I never thought a story could be something that someone would try to steal, then silence. He paused, the weight of his words filling the space. You might think this kind of thing only happens in courtrooms or movie studios. But it doesn't. It happens when a kid gets talked over in class, when a journalist edits out the hard parts, when an artist is told their version of the truth is too raw to print. A student in the back quietly raised her phone to record. Keanu noticed, but didn't stop her. People think fame protects you, he said. It doesn't. Sometimes it puts a target on your back. But what does protect you, what always will, is clarity. Knowing why you created something, knowing what it's worth. He let that linger, then nodded slowly. I'm glad I didn't walk away. Not just because we won, but because a girl with a leather journal reminded me that stories don't belong to the powerful. They belong to those who dare to tell them. A few students smiled, others blinked back unexpected emotion. I was just a guy who loved movies, he said. Then I was a guy on trial for one. Then I was a guy who realized maybe the most important stories aren't told on set. Maybe they're told in rooms like this. He gave a final nod, the quiet in the room almost cinematic. Thank you for letting me be part of your scene today. As he turned to leave, the class burst into applause, not thunderous, but honest. Hands clapped not for a celebrity, but for something deeper, for truth, for courage, for story. Outside, the wind moved through the autumn trees. Keanu stepped out beneath the golden leaves, adjusting the scarf at his neck. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already left something behind, and it would keep speaking. Keanu stood beside the lectern in the empty courtroom after the students had left. The light coming through the windows made the floor shine like water. He took a deep breath, as if still feeling the air of testimony and memory wrapped around the room. His voice would be quiet, but it had always been that way. I wasn't the loudest voice in that courtroom, he began. I never wanted to be. But I remembered something my mother once told me when I was young and uncertain. She said, "You don't need to shout if the truth is clear. Just make sure you're standing where it can be seen." He paused, remembering how her voice used to lower when she was trying to make a point that really mattered. She was a paralegal, never in the spotlight but always carrying the facts. She would underline her notes 3 times, sometimes 4, if she thought a lawyer might miss the meaning. I remembered the law, he continued, but more than that, I remembered why I believed in it. It's not just about rights or codes. It's about the stories we're allowed to tell, and the ones some people would rather keep buried. Another pause. Storytelling isn't always a performance. Sometimes it's a defense. He walked slowly down the aisle between the gallery benches. His hand trailed gently along the wood as if touching the echoes of everything that had happened there. The accusations, the shame, the silence, the truth finally spoken. I didn't come to that courtroom to win, he said. I came to protect what mattered. I came because I've seen what happens when artists walk away, when quiet people stop believing their voice deserves the room. I almost walked away too. He turned and faced the camera that had been recording him for the students who couldn't attend. I'm glad I didn't. Then he said softly but clearly, have you ever been underestimated only to find your moment of clarity? That question hung in the air for a long moment. Then Keanu walked to the front of the camera and sat down, his elbows resting gently on the armrests. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't promoting a movie. Just sitting there, still, honest. I think most people have a moment like that, he said. But we don't always name it. Maybe it happened in a classroom, or at a job interview. Maybe someone told you you weren't ready, or that your voice didn't belong in the room. Maybe it happened quietly, so quietly you didn't even realize it was your moment, until you looked back and saw how far you'd come. He folded his hands. I used to think courage was something loud, he said. But lately, I've realized something else. Courage is often what you don't say. It's the patience to wait, the wisdom to know when to speak, and the faith to believe that the truth doesn't vanish just because someone talks over it. The screen faded softly to black, his voice still carrying through the silence. If you've ever had to prove yourself without shouting, if you've ever held your ground when everyone doubted you, then you already understand what this story is really about. Then, his final call. Share your moment of quiet courage in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it. A short pause. What should I uncover next? One more beat. Subscribe if you believe that truth, not volume, should win. The words appeared on screen in simple white text against black. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that doesn't flinch. Fade out.